Caribbean leaders, including Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness, are in a difficult position. The United States has introduced a new policy that could place travel bans on government officials from countries that continue to engage Cuban healthcare workers. This means leaders across the region, including Holness, may have to choose between standing up to the U.S. or giving in to avoid losing their visas. The U.S. claims that Caribbean nations are exploiting Cuban doctors, but in reality, their real target is Cuba itself. For years, hundreds of Cuban doctors and nurses have worked in Jamaica, providing much-needed medical care, especially to the poor and elderly. Many Jamaicans rely on these doctors for essential services such as eye exams and surgeries, which they would otherwise not be able to afford. However, the U.S. has long criticized Cuba's medical missions, arguing that the Cuban government takes most of the doctors' salaries and does not compensate them fairly. Washington labels this as forced labor and accuses Cuba of human trafficking, claiming that Caribbean countries are supporting these violations by continuing to hire Cuban medical workers. Now, the U.S. is pressuring Caribbean nations like Jamaica and Grenada to stop using Cuban doctors, saying that by doing so, they are allowing Cuba to profit from its healthcare workers. But the real issue is that these countries depend on Cuban doctors to fill gaps in their healthcare systems. If the program is shut down, it would severely impact medical care, particularly in rural areas where there is already a shortage of doctors. This is why CARICOM leaders are seeking a meeting with Washington to clarify the situation. They need to understand whether this is just another political move against Cuba or if the U.S. is truly serious about imposing sanctions on Caribbean leaders over it. The United States has always had a strained relationship with Cuba, dating back to the 1959 Cuban Revolution when Fidel Castro took power and turned the country into a communist state. Since then, the U.S. has imposed multiple sanctions on Cuba, mainly because of its ties with Russia. Washington has consistently tried to weaken the Cuban economy, and cutting off the medical missions is just another way to limit Cuba's ability to earn foreign exchange. Cuban medical programs generate billions for the country, so by forcing other nations to stop hiring Cuban doctors, the U.S. is effectively trying to cut off one of Cuba's major sources of income. This is also part of a larger geopolitical strategy. The United States has always sought to isolate Cuba because it opposes the Cuban government's policies. If countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and Grenada continue to work with Cuba, it goes against U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. justifies this move by saying it is standing up for human rights, arguing that Cuba is exploiting its doctors. However, the U.S. often picks and chooses which human rights issues it wants to address based on its political interests. More importantly, this is about maintaining control over the Caribbean. If the region becomes too dependent on Cuba, China, or Russia, the U.S. sees this as a threat to its influence. The truth is, this is not about protecting Cuban doctors, it is about power, money, and politics. The real question now is what Andrew Holness and other Caribbean leaders will do. Holness is in a tough position with no easy choices. If he follows U.S. demands and stops working with Cuba, he might avoid visa restrictions, but thousands of Jamaicans, especially the elderly and poor, would suffer. Many would lose access to affordable healthcare, and Jamaica's medical system, already under strain, would be further weakened. However, if Holness defies Washington and keeps the Cuban doctors, the U.S. could impose travel bans on him and other government officials. This could also lead to economic consequences, as the U.S. might impose further restrictions on trade or foreign aid to Jamaica. Another option is for Holness and other CARICOM leaders to negotiate a middle ground with the U.S. This is why they are requesting a meeting with Washington, to try and find a way to continue using Cuban doctors without facing sanctions. However, if the U.S. is firm on its stance, these leaders may have to choose between maintaining access to healthcare for their people or protecting their political interests. Jamaica should prioritize the needs of its people because Cuban doctors play a crucial role in providing healthcare to those who cannot afford private medical services. However, the real question is whether Holness has the courage to stand up to Washington or if he will give in to the pressure. Given his history, it is unlikely that he will risk confrontation with the U.S. More than likely, he will try to delay making a decision for as long as possible or quietly scale down the Cuban medical program while presenting it as a routine policy change. If this were the era of Michael Manley, the response would have been different. Manley would have openly resisted U.S. interference and continued working with Cuba. However, Holness is not known for that kind of bold leadership. Most likely, he will try to manage the situation carefully, avoiding direct conflict while finding a way to phase out the Cuban doctors without making it look like he was forced to do so. This will be a test of leadership, but the unfortunate reality is that if he backs down, it is the Jamaican people, especially the most vulnerable, who will suffer the most.